The airplane was cutting through a violent storm high above the dark clouds. Lightning flashed outside the windows, illuminating the frightened faces of passengers for brief seconds. Rain slammed against the aircraft like thousands of tiny stones, and the powerful winds made the wings tremble. Inside the cabin, the soft hum of the engines had turned into an uneasy roar. The seatbelt signs were glowing red, and the flight attendants had already taken their seats. People sat stiffly, gripping their armrests and whispering prayers. Everyone could feel something was wrong, but no one knew how serious the situation really was. Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed through the plane. The aircraft jerked violently to one side, causing several passengers to gasp and cry out in fear. Overhead, luggage compartments rattled as the plane struggled against the storm. A moment later, one of the engines began to fail. Its sound faded into a frightening silence before alarms erupted inside the cockpit. The aircraft dipped slightly, making many passengers feel their stomachs drop. A child began to cry somewhere in the middle rows, while others clutched their loved ones. The peaceful journey had instantly turned into a terrifying fight for survival. In the cockpit, flashing red lights filled the small space. Warning alarms screamed as the pilots tried desperately to understand what was happening. One engine had completely failed, and the other was struggling against the violent winds and heavy rain. The captain's hands moved quickly across the controls, while the co-pilot read emergency procedures aloud. Every second felt like an hour. The aircraft was losing stability, and the storm around them was growing even more dangerous. They both knew the truth, but didn't want to say it out loud. If they couldn't stabilize the plane soon, the situation could become fatal. A deep tension filled the cockpit as the captain realized the storm had pushed them far off their safe route. The instruments flickered, and the plane trembled again. He tried to regain control, but the damaged engine made everything more difficult. The co-pilot attempted to communicate with air traffic control, but the heavy storm was disrupting the signal. Sweat rolled down the captain's forehead as he stared at the chaotic display of warning. Indeed, he had faced difficult situations before, but this one felt different. The aircraft wasn't responding the way it should, and time was slipping away faster than he expected. Back in the cabin, the passengers could feel every violent movement of the plane. Some people whispered prayers under their breath, while others stared silently out the dark windows. A man held his daughter tightly, trying to comfort her, even though fear was visible on his own face. The flight attendants tried their best to remain calm, but even their voices trembled slightly as they reassured the passengers. Every bump of turbulence felt stronger than the last. The cabin lights flickered briefly, and a wave of panic spread through the rows as people realized the danger was becoming very real. Then the intercom suddenly clicked on, breaking the tense silence in the cabin. The captain's voice came through the speakers, but it didn't sound like the calm, confident tone passengers usually heard during flights. Instead, it carried a rare trace of fear. He spoke slowly at first, as if choosing every word carefully, but the urgency in his voice was impossible to hide. The passengers listened closely, their hearts pounding in their chests. No one moved or spoke. Even the crying child grew quiet as everyone waited to hear what the captain was about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice tight with pressure, "we are experiencing a serious mechanical problem combined with extremely dangerous weather conditions." The cabin grew even quieter. People exchanged worried looks with strangers beside them. The captain paused for a moment before continuing. "Is there any trained fighter pilot on board this aircraft?" The unexpected question stunned the passengers. For a second, then many people wondered if they had heard correctly. Fighter pilot on a commercial flight. The idea sounded impossible, yet the fear in the captain's voice made it clear he wasn't joking. "We may not survive this storm without additional help," the captain added quietly over the intercom. The words sent a wave of shock through the cabin. Some passengers covered their mouths in disbelief. while others looked around desperately, hoping someone would stand up. The plane shuddered again as thunder roared outside. Lightning illuminated the entire cabin for a brief moment, revealing wide eyes and pale faces. Everyone suddenly understood how serious the situation had become. But despite the captain's desperate request, no one moved. The cabin remained frozen in silence as fear gripped every passenger. Several seconds passed, but they felt like an eternity. The aircraft continued to shake violently as it fought against the raging storm outside. The captain repeated his request once more, his voice now carrying a stronger sense of urgency. "If there is a trained fighter pilot on board, please come to the cockpit immediately." Passengers looked at each other aghast, but still no one responded. Many people assumed that such a person could not possibly be among them. Others were simply too overwhelmed by fear to think clearly. The cabin felt heavy with tension and uncertainty. In the very last row of the airplane, a woman sat quietly by the window. Most passengers were panicking. She remained strangely calm. Her eyes were closed, as if she had been resting through the entire chaos. The flashing lights from the storm outside briefly illuminated her face. She appeared ordinary, dressed simply like any other traveler. Yet there was something unusual about the stillness in her posture. While everyone else held their breath in fear, she seemed perfectly composed, as though she had faced far worse situations before. Slowly, the woman opened her eyes. The distant sound of thunder echoed through the aircraft as she looked around the frightened cabin. She had heard every word of the captain's announcement. For a moment, she remained seated, thinking carefully. Her gaze moved toward the trembling wings, visible through the small window beside her. She could feel the turbulence and recognize the pattern of the storm. It was not unfamiliar to her. In fact, it reminded her of something from long ago, something she had once trained her entire life to handle. The woman finally unbuckled her seatbelt with a quiet click. The small sound barely caught anyone's attention in the chaotic cabin. She stood up slowly, steady despite the shaking aircraft. A few nearby passengers looked at her with confusion, wondering why she would stand during such dangerous turbulence, but she didn't explain anything. Without panic or hesitation, she began walking down the narrow aisle toward the front of the plane. Each step was calm and confident, even as the aircraft jolted violently around her. Passengers watched her pass with puzzled expressions. Some assumed she might be a flight attendant or someone searching for help. But there was something different about the determination in her eyes. She walked forward as if she knew exactly what she needed to do. The storm continued to roar outside, and the plane trembled again as thunder cracked through the sky. Still, she kept moving toward the cockpit door. None of the frightened passengers realized the truth about the quiet woman walking past them. Years ago, she had been something very few people ever become. She had once been a highly trained fighter pilot, flying powerful aircraft through dangerous skies and extreme combat situations. She had faced storms, emergencies, and life-threatening missions that most people could never imagine. But when she boarded this flight, she had simply been another passenger among hundreds of Rangers. No one knew her past, and she had never intended to reveal it. Yet now, as the plane struggled against the violent storm, fate had placed her exactly where she needed to be. The woman stepped into the cockpit as the door closed behind her. The moment she entered, the tension in the small space was almost overwhelming. Red warning lights flashed across the instrument panels, while loud alarms echoed continuously. The captain and co-pilot both turned in surprise, clearly not expecting a passenger to appear in such a critical moment. The aircraft shook violently again as thunder roared outside the windows. Despite the chaos, the woman's expression remained calm and focused. Her eyes moved quickly across the controls, absorbing every detail of the dangerous situation unfolding before them. For a brief moment, the captain hesitated, unsure whether to trust a stranger in such a life-threatening crisis. But there was something about the woman's confident posture that immediately caught his attention. She wasn't panicking, and her eyes studied the instruments with the precision of someone who understood every warning signal. "I'm a former fighter pilot," she said calmly, her voice steady despite the shaking aircraft. The words immediately changed the atmosphere in the cockpit. The captain exchanged a quick glance with the co-pilot before nodding. At this point, they had no other choice but to trust her experience. The aircraft suddenly dropped several hundred feet as another violent wave of turbulence struck. The woman quickly grabbed the back of the captain's seat to steady herself. She leaned forward and studied the flight displays carefully. One engine had completely failed, while the other struggled to maintain enough thrust. The storm outside was pushing the plane far off its course, and the wind pressure was making control extremely difficult. Within seconds, she understood the danger. The aircraft was losing altitude faster than the pilots could stabilize it, and if nothing changed soon, the situation could become impossible to recover. "Let me try," she said firmly. The captain moved slightly aside while she placed her hands gently on the controls. Years of training returned to her instantly, like a forgotten language suddenly remembered. She adjusted the aircraft's angle carefully, trying to reduce the stress on the remaining engine. The plane trembled again, but her hands remained steady. In the cabin behind them, passengers felt the aircraft shifting as she slowly corrected its balance. Every small movement required careful calculation, because one wrong adjustment could make the situation even worse. Outside the cockpit windows, lightning lit up the massive storm cloud surrounding the aircraft. Rain continued slamming against the windshield as powerful winds pushed the plane in unpredictable directions. The woman carefully studied the altitude indicator and speed readings. The aircraft was descending too quickly, but pushing the engine harder could cause it to fail completely. She adjusted the throttle slightly, allowing the remaining engine to operate within a safer range. The movement was subtle, but it began to slow the dangerous descent that had been terrifying the pilots only moments before. Inside the cabin, passengers clutched their armrests as the aircraft continued to shake. Many people had their eyes closed, whispering prayers or holding the hands of loved ones. A flight attendant glanced away, neared the cockpit door anxiously, hoping the pilots had found a solution. Suddenly, the violent drops began to lessen slightly. The plane was still fighting the storm, but its movements felt more controlled than before. Some passengers noticed the change and looked at each other with cautious hope, though no one yet understood what was happening in the cockpit. Back at the controls, the woman focused intensely on guiding the aircraft through the thick storm clouds. Her mind worked quickly, remembering techniques she had learned during difficult military flights. Fighter jets often faced extreme weather and sudden emergencies, and those experiences were now helping her control the struggling commercial plane. She tilted the wings slightly to reduce the force of the crosswinds and carefully maintained a steady glide path. The captain watched in amazement as the chaotic instrument readings slowly began to stabilize under her precise control. "Altitude is stabilizing," the co-pilot said with visible relief. The woman nodded, but didn't take her eyes off the instruments. The storm was still dangerous, and they were far from safe yet. She quickly asked for nearby airport information. The co-pilot checked the navigation system and located a regional airport within gliding distance. It wasn't large, but its runway might be long enough if they approached carefully. The woman calculated the distance in her mind, measuring their speed, altitude, and remaining engine power before making her next decision. "We're heading there," she said firmly. She adjusted the aircraft's direction, guiding it gradually away from the worst part of the storm. The plane still trembled occasionally, but the violent shaking had begun to fade. In the cabin, passengers felt the difference almost immediately. The terrifying drops were gone, replaced by a smoother but tense glide through the dark sky. People slowly opened their eyes and looked around, unsure whether the danger had truly passed, or if it was only a temporary calm before another disaster. Minutes passed like hours as the aircraft moved closer to the airport. The storm clouds slowly began to thin, and faint lights from the ground became visible through the darkness. The woman guided the plane carefully downward, making small adjustments to keep it balanced. The remaining engine continued to struggle, but it held on long enough to maintain their glide path. The captain could hardly believe what he was witnessing. Just minutes earlier, he had feared the worst. Now the runway lights appeared in the distance, like a path leading them back to safety. The woman aligned the aircraft with the runway and prepared for landing. Without full engine power, the approach had to be perfect. She controlled the descent carefully, adjusting the speed while the wind still pushed against the wings. The runway lights grew brighter and larger as the plane descended through the final stretch of sky. Inside the cabin, passengers held their breath as they felt the aircraft lowering toward the ground. The tension was unbearable, but there was also a growing sense that somehow, against all odds, they might survive. The wheels finally touched the runway with a heavy thud. The aircraft bounced slightly before settling as the brakes engaged. A loud roar filled the cabin as the tires gripped the wet surface of the runway. The plane slowed rapidly, rolling forward until it finally came to a complete stop. For a moment there was complete silence. Then suddenly, the entire cabin erupted into emotional cheers, applause, and tears of relief. People hugged each other, overwhelmed by the realization that they were alive. In the cockpit, the captain leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily as the adrenaline slowly faded. He looked at the woman with disbelief and deep gratitude. "You saved all of us," he whispered quietly. His voice carried a mixture of exhaustion and admiration. The co-pilot nodded in agreement, still amazed by the calm precision she had shown during the terrifying crisis. Without her help, the outcome could have been very different. The woman simply smiled gently, as if the entire experience had been just another ordinary challenge. She removed her hands from the controls and stepped back from the captain's seat. The storm outside was beginning to move away, leaving only distant thunder in the night sky. Without asking for or recognition or praise, she quietly thanked the pilots and walked toward the cockpit door. A few minutes later, she returned to the cabin, where the passengers were still celebrating their survival. Most of them never realized who had truly guided the aircraft to safety. She calmly took her seat again, fastening her seatbelt as if nothing extraordinary had happened. To everyone else on board, she was just another passenger on the flight. But in the hearts of the pilots, who had witnessed her courage and skill, the mysterious woman would never be forgotten. She had appeared when hope was nearly gone and disappeared just as quietly once the danger had passed, leaving behind a story that would be remembered for years.